invasion and the Babylonian problems. And of course, in the 6th century, you're dealing with the actual exile that came out of the Babylonian conquest of Jerusalem. And so when we study the Bible, we can talk about things as pre-exilic or exilic or post-exilic. The reason we call it exilic or the exile is because the exile is one of the two most significant events in Israelite history. The Exodus was the first significant event where they became a nation, and then the exile is the second most important historical event in the life of Israel because it threatened their existence as a nation. And so that's one good way to think about biblical history and to remember different events within that main structure. And then if we were to look at some of the study of the prophets, I mentioned this in the lecture that I gave in 2010, Living in Captivity. I did a lecture on Ezekiel 37, sort of as a case study of the prophets, and then I used that as a way to look at the entire phenomenon of prophetism in the ancient Near East, and in particular in Israel. And this particular table or taxonomy that I generated in that lecture looked at several different analyses that were done over the years, one in the late 19th century, and then one in the 20th century, and then one in the 21st century. And they're all basically different ways of looking at the same material. So, for example, here in Beecher's study that was in 1888, he divided the prophetic material into three main themes. That the Bible is talking about the sin that's involved with the people, and the result of that would be punishment or judgment. And then after the judgment, there would be a time of hope or renewal. And those are three themes that you can clearly see in the prophets. In his analysis in 2002, Brent Sandy broke that up a little differently. He took the sinful present part and divided into God's part and man's part. Like the deity is the one who put down the legislation. Don't do this. Thou shalt not worship other gods and so forth. And then the humanity part was they were the ones who disobeyed. And so instead of the word judgment, he uses calamity. Instead of the word restoration or hope, he uses prosperity. And that's just another word to talk about the same thing. His theme, all of the words end in ity, deity, humanity, calamity, prosperity. That's his way of remembering the themes. And then in the Interpreter's Dictionary of the Bible, the supplement edition, Napier in the middle of the 20th century did a more extensive analysis of the prophets and broke up each of the themes that we read in the prophets into 8 categories. And so he basically divided the deity part or the sinful present part into revelation and election. That is, revelation, God is revealing himself to the people. He's demonstrating, thus saith the Lord. Those kinds of words would have reference to his revealing himself and speaking to the people through the prophets. The election part was the fact that Israel had a special place in God's plan. They didn't deserve it, but they got it anyway. And so he elected them. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Abraham was a good man, but he wasn't perfect. Isaac was a good man, but he wasn't perfect. Jacob was a very he deceived people on many occasions. But God blessed him in spite of that fact. So there are references in the prophetic material that talk about Israel as a elect nation. And so that's part of what we would see in that area. And then in the humanity part, there's rebellion and then sin. There's repentance of sin and instead of calamity, judgment. And in the prosperity part, there's compassion. There are elements in the material that we read that are filled with compassion. How can I give thee up, O Israel? I'm punishing you, but I just can't utterly destroy you. I'm going to bring you back to prosperity someday in the future. And then there's a redemption, not only presently, politically, where they get to go home in their geographical homeland in the Levant, in Palestine, but beyond that, there is the looking into the messianic hope, where there will be a son of David, someone that's descendant from David that would be bringing up a kingdom all over again, which, of course, many people would think of as political and military, but that's not the kind of kingdom that Jesus came to establish. And so these are themes that we're going to see in all of the prophetic materials. As I mentioned a couple of weeks ago, in the West and in the United States and in Europe, there is a way to express communication in a written form that is more linear, like we have an introduction, the main thing we want to talk about, and then a conclusion. And we're very analytical, and we try to write our essays in a very organized fashion. But outside of the West, if we go into the East, into the Oriental world, and in the ancient Near East, where the biblical compositions were made, there is more of a recursive, cyclical type of writing, where there's a bunch of themes out there, or ideas, and they're just constantly cycled through over and over again. Think of the book of Proverbs that we studied just recently, where there are, discussions about what we should do with our hands and making a living and being wise, or staying away from immorality and that kind of a problem. And looking to the ant, O sluggard, to consider your ways and how diligent this little insect might be, and so forth. And there are lots of different themes in terms of maybe parental and children's relationships, work relationships, taking care of our families, and all of those things are recycled over and over again, so that almost any 2 chapters of Proverbs covers all of those themes. And then you read 2 more chapters and they're recycled. And we might think in our minds in the West, in our analytical framework of thinking, but why didn't somebody just do all of them that has to do with work in a couple of chapters, and then in the next few chapters deal with family relationships, and then in the next few chapters deal with something else? And so that's the way we would think about it. And if we're told in an English class in high school to write an essay of 3 main points, we would have a 5-paragraph essay where we have sort of an introduction, maybe something interesting and creative to get the reader's attention, and then mention what we're talking about, and then do 3 things like paragraph 2, 3, and 4. And then the 5th paragraph, we kind of summarize and make some observations and thoughts about where this might lead us and the significance of it and so forth. And that is what we consider to be a good essay. And in other parts of the world, there are different ways to look at it. And so rather than strictly linear from point A to point B, you have a recursive, cyclical, cycle type of thing that is found in the Bible. So in the prophets, you're going to see all of these points. It's not like chapter 1 is revelation, chapter 2 is election, chapter 3 is rebellion and sin. No, it's not that at all. It's all of those things mixed up in every chapter or every 2 chapters. So that when you're reading Hosea or Amos or Isaiah or any of these prophets, you're constantly jumping from these themes, one next to the other. And so you have to be alert. You have to be prepared. And keep in mind that these were first oracles that were delivered orally, and then either the prophet himself or one of his disciples or followers under inspiration from God collected them and put them into more permanent written form. And then they came down through the ages to us. And we're looking at it now and trying to figure out what it means. All right. And one of the books I've been recently looking at, Interpreter's Dictionary or Interpreter's Commentary on the Bible, a new one. There's an old set and there's a new set. And whenever I go through and study something, I'll take a couple of new things that I haven't explored and then just add that to what I've read before. And so this particular passage you can read, Hosea offers us impressions about the experiences of a typical prophet. And prophets did not enjoy a life of ease, nor did they bask in people's adoration. Their words were not welcomed by their hearers, but instead they were openly disparaged, ridiculed, thrown into prison, run out of town, and even crucified. Jesus was a prophet, of course, the prophet of prophets. And think about how his generation received him. There were some people who adored him, and there were some people that heard him gladly, and there were other people who were looking to end his life immediately. And unfortunately, a majority of the people at the time felt that way, at least the people in positions of power. So some examples here that you might see. All right, let's take a look at some text here, and we'll ask questions about which theme you think this has reference to. Hear the word of the Lord, O people of Israel. Let me just stop there. This would be Revelation if we were to look at an analytical framework that came out in the Interpreter's Dictionary of the Bible in 1962. And so this is a passage, the first part of verse 4, that is speaking about the oracle as coming from Yahweh. This message, although Hosea was the instrument that God used, was really a communication from God. And so Hosea was just the instrument or the vessel, the tool that God used to communicate the message. So hear the word of the Lord, O children of Israel, for the Lord has a controversy with the inhabitants of the land. There is no faithfulness or kindness or no knowledge of God in the land. You might ask, well, what is there? Well, there's swearing, lying, killing, stealing, committing adultery. They break all bounds and murder follows murder. So this is describing the sinful present. This is describing the social situation in which Hosea finds himself. And he is sensitive to what that means. God sees what's happening. He's not going to allow it to continue forever. So the people need to repent and stop it. And that's his message, basically. And so the extension for us in our generation is, well, are there times when we might be involved in a period of time in history where there is a lot of stealing, swearing, lying, killing, committing adultery? Well, yeah, I mean, any generation, I suppose. But, I'm thinking about the time in which we find ourselves where there's smash and grab things that are videotaped all over the country. People just have, the audacity to go into a place of business with a mallet or hammer and smash the display cabinets and take what they want as if they're entitled to it, really. And we might ask ourselves as a society, well, can this continue? Is this something that is sustainable? And of course we would say, of course it can't be sustained. And so, therefore the land mourns. We might say the country cries. And all who dwell in it languish, and also the beasts of the field and the birds of the air, and even the fish of the sea are taken away. Now this is a part that is hyperbole. It's an exaggeration to make an effect. As you might read this and say, well, what's it mean talking about beasts, birds, and fish? We're not talking about beasts, birds, and fish. He's talking about the people sinful in the land. And the land mourns, and all of those who dwell in it languish. Also the beasts of the field, the birds of the heavens, the fish of the sea are taken away. Are taken away has to do with the captivity that's going to happen. This part here, the are taken away, is the Assyrian captivity that he's alluding to, that's on the horizon. And people who are living at that time in the land in the north, particularly, and the capital city of Samaria in particular, are going to be taken captive. Their captives, their captors are going to come and take them with 6-foot chains. This was the first time they did social distancing, okay? And they would take these chains with 6 feet, and there would be hooks every 6 feet. What would they do? They would take those hooks and throw them right through their nose. They would shave the men and the women. They would shave their heads. They would be bald. That was a way of making them humble and humiliating them. They would also make them march to Nineveh naked, just marching through the whole countryside naked. Sometimes they would be allowed to wear sandals because they were planning to use some of these people as slaves. And so they did want them to come to their country relatively healthy so they could use them as slaves. So they might allow them to wear sandals so that they could make the journey. But if they were already injured or they were already a burden, they would simply take their sword and slice them right there on the spot. In front of everybody, of course, there's value in making people see that kind of horror. By the way, in the 20th century, the Germans did the same thing in the Nazi regime throughout Europe. They did the same things. They cut off the hair of the women. The German officers actually, they weaved inner linings to their garments made from the Jewish women's hair. Very creative. And of course, nothing wasted. Germans weren't going to waste anything. If any of these people that were put into the gas chambers had gold teeth, why? Well, we're gonna gas them, put them on the table, make sure we take out anything valuable that we might use, and save it, and then we'll put the body in the crematorium. It's horrific, and war is horrific, and the prophets are talking about horrors of what they were going to experience because of their sins, and it was something that they could have easily avoided if they would simply have obeyed God and not worshipped these other idols. So in verse 4, he goes on to say, "Yet let no one contend and let no one accuse. For with you is my contention, O priest. You shall stumble by day, and the prophets shall stumble with you by night, and I will destroy your mother." Let me just pause here and ask a question. He's critical here of both the prophet and the priest. The priests in the land, think about what Jezebel did when she brought all of her priests from Phoenicia into the land in the time of Ahab. And the whole priesthood religion in the north was destroyed because of that. It was started that way by Jeroboam I, the son of Nebat, who put his golden calves at 2 cities, one in the north and one in the south. We studied this recently. Holly went over it. What were the 2 cities? One in the north and one in the south of Israel. Dan and Bethel. Dan to the north and Bethel to the south. And the reason that he did that was to keep the people within the geographical confines of Israel. They didn't have to go to Judah. We certainly don't want them to go and climb that central mountain range up to Jerusalem and worship at the temple where Rehoboam and his palace is. That might get them to be more affectionate toward Judah. No, we don't want that. We're going to create our own religion and make the people worship here in the north at Dan and Bethel. And so the priest is being critical here, or they're being criticized, because they are making the people worship false gods and idols. The prophet is being criticized because were there people, let me just put it this way, were there people that were yes men back then that were just when the people in charge wanted to hear something, there were people that say, I'm a prophet, I'll tell you what you want to hear. And then I'd get a paycheck for doing that. Were there people like that back then? Are there people in positions close to powerful people? Let's say a president of the United States, for example, and the people surrounding that person. Are there people there that are in positions of power that are just going to tell the president or anyone what they want to hear to stay in that position of power? The answer is yes. And that's not true only of current administration. That's true throughout history, okay? Whoever's in these positions, you have that temptation. Pardon? Yes, that's right. So when he's critical of the prophet here, he's not talking about himself. He's a prophet, all right. But he's critical here of what kind of prophet? A false prophet. Does he use the adjective all the time, false, in front of the noun prophet? Not here. Sometimes the prophets do that, but many times, if not most times, they just say the prophet and they mean the false prophet. They mean the prophet who's doing this for a career move, for making money. Hosea wasn't in this for the money. In fact, God told him, you studied this last time, very unusual request. What did he ask Hosea to do? Marry a prostitute, a harlot, a whore. Yeah. Why would God ask someone to do that? The prophets were role-playing. They were models you had an analogy between the way they were behaving and the way God was behaving. And the reason that he asked Hosea to do this was so that people could see such horrible stuff, like, why would you do this? And you can imagine the prophet saying, I'm glad you asked me that question. God has done this with you. And just as Gomer has been unfaithful to me as a prophet, as a husband, and I'm trying to be a good husband to her, she's constantly stepping out on me, as you can see. That's how God is with you. And you're constantly unfaithful to Yahweh. And he tells you not to worship Baal and Asherah and Chemosh and Molech and all these other gods, and yet you keep doing that. So he feels like I feel. And so that's why God asked Hosea to do that. Very unusual thing. He tells Jeremiah to bury his underwear near the Euphrates River, and when we study Jeremiah, we can explore that very interesting thing. Why? He tells Ezekiel to lay on the side and play with Lego blocks like they're Jerusalem. They weren't Lego blocks, I have to say. But that's like what they were, see? And he's laying on the side, and he's making a model of the city of Jerusalem, and battering rams coming up against the walls, and you might think, well, why is he doing it? He's showing the people in captivity what's about to happen back home. You want to go home? Well, the home is about to be destroyed, ladies and gentlemen. And they didn't understand that. Or when Ezekiel's wife dies, he doesn't mourn for her. And there are reasons why that is the case. My people, verse 6 says, are destroyed for lack of knowledge. Because you have rejected knowledge, I reject you from being priest to me. And since you have forgotten the law of your God, I will also forget your children. I know that when we see bad things that happen in history, and we see horrific things happen in the Second World War in the time of Hitler, and also in the 20th century in the time of Stalin and Mao, and the Kim family in North Korea, and in communist Cuba with Fidel Castro. And throughout the world, we say, well, why Francisco Franco in Spain and what he did to his own people is horrific. And we say, why does God allow such things to happen? Now, we don't have all the answers to these questions, but we do know that there are some principles in the Bible that God does allow bad things to happen, sometimes even to good people. The book of Job helps us understand a little bit of the dynamics of that. Even though all of our questions aren't answered, we do know that there are some things that Job did not know about his own predicament. But we, as the readers, do know about his predicament. And the point is that in our own time and situation, there are things that are happening around us that we don't understand. But God knows, and God understands. And so we put our faith and our trust in him, and we do what's within our power to do and to be faithful to him. But these people, the prophet and the priest that were unfaithful to God, were going to be destroyed. Notice verse 15. We'll drop down to verse 15 and 16. Though you play the harlot, O Israel, let not Judah become guilty. Enter not into Gilgal, nor go up to Beth-aven, and swear not as the Lord lives. Like a stubborn heifer, Israel is stubborn. Can the Lord now feed them like a lamb in broad pasture? And so in the Bible and in the prophetic periods, we see references to divided monarchy. We're studying this also on Wednesday evenings, the divided monarchy. After the time of Saul and David and Solomon, the kingdom divided, in the days of Rehoboam in the south, and then Jeroboam was getting 10 tribes in the north. So in the north, we have here Israel. There's a divided line here, sort of a line of demarcation between Judah in the south and Israel in the north. Hosea is speaking to Israel in the north. He's also speaking to the people of Judah here in the south, telling the people here what's happening up here. The capital city of Samaria was going to be destroyed in 722 BC. And if you look on this whole map here, we don't see any town or city named Beth-aven, do we? What's the closest thing we see there that might be close to that? Bethel. Bethel in the Hebrew, the word Beth is house. And do you know the word El? What's that? El? God. Bethel is house of God. Hosea doesn't call Bethel the house of God because this was the place where there was idolatrous worship taking place since the days of Jeroboam the first. And he calls it Beth-aven. This is where my reference to Crook County comes in, because when I say Crook County, everyone knows that's not really the official name. We just use it because it's kind of indicative of some of the situation of corruption in that place. Beth-aven is the house of vanity instead of the house of God. The word Aven or Havel is like the first words of the book of Ecclesiastes. Havel, Havalim, Kol Havel. Vanity of vanity, all is vanity. And so when the prophet Hosea uses Beth-aven, he's calling the city of Beth a derogatory term. Not only for the people in Israel to reel at, like, why are you calling our city Beth-aven? That's, you're ridiculing us. You're not giving us the honor we deserve. It's Bethel. No, it's Beth-aven to me, because you are worshiping wrongly there. And so, but he doesn't tell us he's using a pun or a linguistic pun. He just does it. It's up to us to figure it out later, right? And so that's the term he uses several times. It means house of vanity. Now, some of you have study Bibles, reference Bibles that might have footnotes or side notes or annotations to that effect, and that's wonderful to do and have those examples. And that's a two-edged sword, because sometimes the explanations are correct and sometimes they're incorrect, and they're denominationally oriented and all kinds of things. So you can be very discerning with that. So if you go to chapter 5, hear this, O priest. Give heed, O house of Israel. Hearken, O house of the king. For the judgment pertains to you, for you have been a snare at Mizpah and a net spread upon Tabor. And they have made the deep pit of Shittim, and I will chastise all of them. These are cities of Israel that would fall to the Assyrians and ultimately be destroyed because of the sinful behavior that was taking place throughout the land, especially in such cities as Bethel and Dan. And Bethel, Hosea's favorite term for it, was not Bethel, but Beth-aven, house of vanity. I know Ephraim, he says here in verse 3, and Israel is not hid from me. For now, O Ephraim, you have played the harlot. Israel is defiled. Their deeds do not permit them to return to their God. For the spirit of harlotry is within them, and they know not the Lord. The pride of Israel testifies to his face. Ephraim shall stumble in his guilt. Judah also shall stumble with them. So you see here, the description is of harlotry, because that is what Hosea is experiencing with his own domestic family. His wife has not been faithful to him, and that is horrific on the part of a spouse. Whenever this occurs, it hurts the spouse that is being stepped out on in a big way, right? Because you form the relationship of marriage on the assumption that you would be faithful and loyal and so forth. And God created the covenant relationship with Israel on the assumption that they would be faithful to him as a God, and that he would take care of them as a God to his people. And so the prophets in Jeremiah 2, in Hosea 4, in Hosea 12, and in Micah chapter 6 are passages of covenant lawsuit, where God has a lawsuit against his people because there were two parts of an agreement, and one of the parties was not faithful to the contract. And so God might say, well, in what part of the contract did I fail you that you decided to go off and worship Baal? Can you have the decency to tell me where I failed you as a God? The prophets are stating language that way for effect. God is not seeking information. He knows all things. He's omniscient. He knows everything. He is stating these questions for effect, just like when he said to Adam and Eve in the garden, where are you? It wasn't like God needed the intelligence and he needed to figure it out, their geographical location, or the GPS was not working. No, that wasn't it. God knew exactly where they were. But the question is asked to penetrate their heart and say, well, I think I messed up. Yeah, you bet you did. Of course, you see an image here on the left-hand side of the screen of the image of Baal that was used in so many artistic, this was just a bas-relief type of imagery, but a lot of times they were actually made into three-dimensional objects and images that there would be like handheld types of deities they could put up on top of their mantle at home or hide under a pillow if they were trying to hide it. And so in verse 8 of chapter 5, blow the horn in Gibeah, the trumpet in Ramah, Sound the alarm at Bethaven. Again, notice he's not calling it Bethel. He's using a derogatory term. He's saying Crook County instead of Cook County. Sound the alarm in Bethaven. Tremble, O Benjamin. Ephraim shall become a desolation in the day of punishment among the tribes of Israel. I declare what is sure. The princes of Judah have become like those who remove the landmark. Upon them I will pour out my wrath like water. And so Amos put it this way: let justice flow down like waters and righteousness as a mighty stream. His passage is a little more famous than the passage here in Hosea, but the same idea is there. God is going to send judgment. You know, whenever we live in a time when bad things happen and we wonder, well, are you paying attention, God? Can you see what's going? Yes, of course he knows. Sometimes he allows things to get really bad before they get better. And this is a cycle of history that happens over and over and over again. We just happen to be living in this generation of whatever cycle and part of the cycle it might be. And so we have to think about it and do what we can to make a difference. And the most significant impact that we can make as God's people is to be faithful to God and to allow our families and our children and grandchildren to see that faithfulness to God and emulate righteousness and let that infiltrate society through the dynamic of the people that we influence the most. In the congregation, in the church, it's the same way. We have, a small group of people, and yet we're able, each family and each person has contacts with other people in different situations, and we let our example penetrate the people around us. Or to use a common biblical imagery, we let our light so shine before men that they may see our good works. And of course, a good result happens, glorifying our Father, which is in heaven. So we mentioned the different themes in the prophetic paradigm, or the different topics that sometimes cycle through the language of the prophets. Here's a call to repentance. Come, let us return to Yahweh, for he has torn us that he may heal us. He has stricken, and he will bind us up. After 2 days he will revive us, and on the third day he will raise us up, that we may live before him. Let us press on to know Yahweh. His going forth is sure as the dawn, and he will come to us as the showers, as the spring rains that water the earth. So God sends the judgment. He sends the punishment. He causes the injury and the bruising and the flesh wounds. But he also holds the bandages and the ointments ready. Just come back to him, and he will bind us up. What about verse 2? Is there an allusion there that might raise your eyebrow a little bit? After 2 days he will revive us, and on the third day he will raise us up. What happened to Jesus? It mimics what happens to Jesus. It anticipates. Of course, this is before Jesus. So it anticipates what might happen. So the third day, Jesus rose from the dead. That's right. And so as God's people, our hope becomes flourishing when Jesus is raised from the dead. In the context of Hosea's, I would dare say, probably Hosea didn't have any thought about Jesus himself when he was saying this, but he was an instrument that was used by God to relay a message that would have a meaning immediately and an effective meaning somewhere else in history as well. I don't know that for sure. It's entirely possible that Hosea had total perceptive insight into everything he wrote or said. But I suspect not. And that God used that language despite the limitations of the messenger himself. I mean, we look in the New Testament and we see what Peter preached on the first gospel sermon and how extensive message it was to mean. And yet there was a time later on that Paul had to withstand him to his face because of the Judaizing teachers and his temptation to fall in line with the Judean leaders on the Judaizing cult and so forth. So, I mean, even though the messenger of God speaks the truth, that does not mean that they practice it perfectly or understand it perfectly. I'm perfectly aware that the preaching of the gospel and the teaching of the gospel message, when it is proclaimed in the consistency of Scripture, will have tremendous, powerful effect beyond what I might even be perceiving or thinking about as I teach the passage. Because God can use the message to transform lives, and in ways that I may not even be aware that ever occurs to me, but it does. And that's the power of the message itself. So next time, we'll be looking at chapters 7, 8, and 9. I encourage you to look at those sections ahead of time, and then when we come together, we'll be able to explore it together in a way that will be profitable for all of us. Note the spelling of profitable as opposed to another profit. Thank you so much for your participation and attention. We'll continue next time, Lord willing. Thank you.